The candles had been burning for 6 hours when Duke Lucien D'Artois finally looked up from the military dispatches spread across his war table and said, without particular emphasis, that he needed a wife. Not wanted, not desired, needed, the way a general needs a supply line, the way a siege needs ammunition. Around him, 3 advisors stood in careful silence, each one reading the room with the trained instinct of men who had survived his moods for years. The fire crackled. Outside, Raverin's north wind threw itself against the stone walls like something trying to get in or get out. Lucien set down his quill and stared at nothing for a long moment, and the advisors understood with absolute certainty that this was not a conversation. It was a verdict. "Find me someone suitable," he said, "and find her quickly." What happened next would change everything none of them had the wisdom to predict. The morning they brought her name to his desk, it was buried third on a list of 7. Lucien had not asked for a list. He had asked for a solution, and his chancellor, a thin, precise man named Aldrich Howe, who had served 3 generations of D'Artois dukes and survived each one by being indispensable, had interpreted that as authorization to produce 7 pages of handwritten genealogical summaries, cross-referenced against the current political liabilities of every major noble house between Raverin's northern border and the capital. Lucien read approximately half of the first page before he set it down. "Give me the short version." Aldrich clasped his hands in front of him, the way he always did when he was about to deliver information he believed would be unwelcome. The most advantageous match, by pure political calculus, would be Lady Seraphine of House Aldenmore. She is 22, well connected to the Southern trade guilds, and her family controls 2 mountain passes that would significantly strengthen our... Her father tried to have my uncle poisoned 17 years ago. He did not succeed. That's the argument you're making. Aldrich did not blink. I am simply noting that the attempt was unsuccessful and that 17 years is a considerable interval. Lucien leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The ceiling of his study was old stone, unadorned, darkened by decades of fire smoke. He had spent considerable time staring at it over the years. It had never given him anything useful, but he kept trying. Who's third on the list? Lady Eveline Valecrest of House Valecrest. A brief pause. The family is in difficult financial circumstances. The late Lord Valecrest left significant debts when he died 3 winters ago, and the estate has been managed since by Lady Eveline and her mother. They have been largely unsuccessful at reversing the decline. Lucien looked back down at the desk. Why is she on the list at all, then? Because House Valecrest, despite its current difficulties, holds the deed to the Myrith Vale Granary Network. 7 stations along the Eastern Grain Road. In a political climate where we are facing pressure from the Morcant coalition and the Eastern Lords are watching to see which direction to align themselves, controlling that network would be useful. Extraordinarily useful. A silence. The fire in the hearth popped once, loudly, like something punctuating the moment. How old? 24. Family history. Clean, no scandals of note. The father was known as a man of principle, if not a man of great competence in financial matters. The mother is said to be a dignified woman who has handled the decline of the estate with considerable grace. Lady Eveline herself is described as, Aldrich consulted the page in his hand with the faintest hesitation, quiet, scholarly, not known in court circles. Lucien's expression did not change. Meaning she's plain. Meaning she prefers books to balls, according to my sources. Whether that translates to plainness, I cannot say with authority. Bring her for an introduction next week. Aldrich nodded once, already moving toward the door. I will arrange it. And Aldrich. The Chancellor stopped. If she turns out to be the kind of woman who cries at parties, send her home the same day. Aldrich said nothing, which Lucien had long since learned to interpret as agreement. Eveline Valecrest received the summons on a Tuesday, which was the day she normally spent reviewing the estate accounts. She was sitting at the small writing desk in the corner of what had once been her father's study, which she had gradually taken over in the years since his death, not through any formal claim, but simply through persistent presence. The estate steward, a well-meaning old man named Corvin, who had served her father loyally and was fundamentally incapable of refusing a direct request from anyone who looked him in the eye, had initially tried to redirect her to the sitting room. She had thanked him warmly and continued setting up her papers on the larger desk. After the third or fourth time, he stopped redirecting her. The summons arrived by official courier, sealed with the D'Artois crest in black wax, and her mother sat down on the chaise across the room when Eveline read it aloud and did not speak for a long time. "Ravarin," her mother finally said. "Yes." "Duke d'Artois." "It appears so." Her mother was a woman who had been beautiful once, and who still carried beauty the way old architecture carries beauty, not in spite of its wear but woven through it, structural, inevitable. She had large eyes that missed very little and had missed nothing at all since her husband's death, which had revealed the family's true financial situation to her with the comprehensive cruelty of a floodgate breaking. "You understand what this means?" her mother said. Not a question. "It means he wants the grain network," Eveline said. She had already folded the summons neatly and set it on the corner of the desk, parallel to the edge. "And someone advised him that acquiring it through marriage costs less than acquiring it through litigation or force." Her mother looked at her for a moment. "Are you all right?" Eveline picked up her pen and looked back at the accounts. The numbers had not improved during this interruption. They had not improved in 3 years of daily attention. They seemed to be impervious to concern. "I'm fine, Mother." "Eveline." I said I'm fine. She wrote a number down, crossed it out, wrote it again. "We have 11,000 in debt that has to be settled before Winter or Corvin's wage agreement collapses. We have 22 servants who have been taking reduced pay for 14 months. We have a roof that needs replacing on the east wing and a water mill that hasn't worked in 2 seasons. She set the pen down and looked at her mother steadily, from behind the glasses that she wore because without them, the numbers blurred. And everything blurred, and she had learned early in her life that blurred vision was not a luxury she could afford. "I understand what this means." Her mother's expression was one of the most complicated things Eveline had ever seen on a human face. It contained love and grief and guilt in proportions that shifted as she watched, and also something that looked distressingly like relief, which her mother clearly knew was there and was clearly not comfortable about. "He has a reputation," her mother said quietly. "I know. He is not a kind man. I know that too. The stories from Ravarin are mostly exaggeration, probably. Courts love exaggeration. It gives them something to discuss that isn't their own marriages." Eveline picked up her pen again. "And even if they're not exaggeration, even if he's exactly as cold as they say." She did not finish the sentence, because the sentence, if finished, would have said something like, "Then at least the debts will be paid," and she did not especially want to hear herself say that aloud in front of her mother. She said instead, "I'll go to Ravarin." Dimamut. The journey north took 4 days, in a borrowed carriage with 2 of the estate's remaining horses, and Corvin riding alongside as her nominal escort, which they both understood was a formal gesture rather than a practical one. Eveline spent most of the journey reading, not because she didn't want to look at the landscape, but because the landscape of northern Valadorn in late autumn was the kind of unrelenting gray that felt personal, like it was specifically designed to inform you of your own smallness. She read 3 books on the history of the Northern Territories, 1 treatise on estate management under conditions of political instability, and approximately 50 pages of a novel she had borrowed from her mother before realizing it was a romance and setting it face down on the seat beside her, like a piece of evidence she didn't want to be associated with. She thought about Lucien D'Artois, as objectively as she could manage. He was 31. He had inherited the title at 20 after his father died in a campaign against the border skirmishes that had been destabilizing the Northeast for a decade. He had ended those skirmishes through a combination of military action and political maneuvering that people still disagreed about, the disagreement breaking cleanly along the lines of whether you thought the outcome justified the methods. He had doubled the Northern Empire's revenue in 6 years. He had executed 2 of his own vassals for corruption, publicly, which had created a climate of either disciplined loyalty or pure terror, depending on who you asked. He had never been married. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman whose name the histories mentioned only obliquely. and the engagement had ended under circumstances that were described uniformly as mutual agreement in the official accounts and described as something considerably less mutual in the whispered versions that circulated through the courts of Valadorn's southern cities. What Eveline had been unable to find in any of her reading was a single account of Lucien D'Artois doing something kind. She thought about this for a while. The carriage wheels found a rut in the road and then found their way out of it, and the motion rocked her gently sideways. He didn't have to be kind. He had to be tolerable. There was a significant distance between those two things, and she had spent 24 years becoming very good at functioning in that space between them. She picked up the romance novel, considered it, put it back face down. Outside, it started to snow. Reverend Castle appeared first as a silhouette against the winter sky, which was the color of cold iron and showed no intention of lightning. It was larger than she had imagined, which surprised her because she had deliberately imagined it large. The walls were the gray-black stone of the northern quarries, the kind that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and the towers rose at each corner with the specific purposeful height of architecture that had been designed not for beauty, but for seeing enemies approaching from a distance. There was a village at the base of the hill, substantial, organized, the streets between the buildings straight in a way that suggested planning rather than organic growth. And the road through it was well maintained despite the weather. The people they passed did not look afraid, which she had also been prepared for. They looked like people who lived in a cold place under a demanding lord and had arranged their expressions accordingly, careful, correct, giving away nothing for free. Inside the castle gate, a steward named Master Fenwick met the carriage and escorted her to a set of rooms in the east wing with the efficient courtesy of a man who processed guests the way administrators process documents, correctly, promptly, without particular personal investment. The rooms were clean and well furnished, and completely without warmth in any sense that was not purely physical. There was a fire in the hearth. There were heavy curtains on the windows. There was a writing desk and a bed, and 2 chairs arranged before the fire with the mathematical precision of someone who had read a description of comfort without having experienced it. "The Duke will receive you tomorrow morning," Master Fenwick said at the door. 10 o'clock. I will send someone to escort you." "Thank you," Eveline said. After he left, she sat down on the edge of the bed, which was very fine and also somehow emphasized its own emptiness, and looked at the window for a while. The snow was coming down harder now. It made the glass look like it was slowly dissolving. She took off her glasses, cleaned them on the hem of her sleeve, put them back on. Tomorrow. Check. She wore her best dress to the meeting, which was a dark blue wool that had been remade twice in 5 years to keep pace with changing silhouettes and the realities of a shrinking wardrobe budget, and which looked, she thought with the private honesty she extended only to herself in mirrors, somewhat like a very earnest effort. Her hair she had pinned up carefully the way her mother had taught her, severe and neat, because her mother had told her when she was 15 that a woman whose appearance suggested she had tried too hard was at the mercy of everyone around her, and a woman who wore severity like something she had chosen was at the mercy of no one. The glasses she wore because she needed them to see. This had occasionally been described to her by people who thought they were being helpful as unfortunate. She had come to regard it as simply accurate. The escort, a young castle guard who couldn't have been more than 19 and who was working very hard to appear casual, brought her through corridors that grew progressively less ceremonial and more functional as they walked, until they arrived at a set of double doors that were plain heavy oak without ornamentation, which told Eveline something immediately about the man on the other side. Doors that tried to impress were for men who needed to impress. Plain doors that were simply solid and large were for men who had already decided what they thought of themselves and found ceremony beneath that assessment. The guard knocked. A voice from inside said, "Send her in," and that was the first time she heard Lucien D'Artois speak, and she noted with the detached part of her mind that never quite stopped taking inventory that his voice had no effect in it. Not coldness, exactly. Not warmth. Simply the absence of performance, which was either confidence or damage, or some specific northern alloy of both. She went in. He was standing at the window, which was probably deliberate, because standing at a window when someone entered a room was one of the more effective ways of forcing them to come to you, and it allowed several seconds of evaluation during which you owed the other person nothing. She walked in, stopped at the appropriate distance, and waited. He turned around. Lucien D'Artois was tall in the way that some men were tall as a structural feature rather than a physical one, something that organized the space around him rather than simply occupying it. He had dark hair, cut short and without vanity, and a face that looked like it had been assembled with the primary goal of being readable from a distance during military engagements. Strong lines, nothing soft, the kind of jaw that looked like a decision. He was dressed plainly, in dark clothing without decoration, and his eyes were a gray that matched the winter sky outside the window with a precision that seemed almost intentional. He looked at her the way you look at a document that's been placed on your desk. The assessment took approximately 4 seconds. She stood very still during it, her hands folded in front of her, her back straight, her expression neither inviting his judgment nor flinching from it, because there was no version of this moment that was not a judgment, and she had decided in the carriage that her only available strategy was to meet it squarely. Then he said it. "You are too plain for me." The words were not loud. They were not particularly inflected. They arrived with the specific weight of a statement of fact. Not cruelty for the pleasure of cruelty. Not calculation. Not performance. Simply an observation from a man who had apparently decided that normal social filters did not apply to this conversation, or possibly to any conversation. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Eveline to notice the texture of the rug under her feet, the sound of the fire, the fact that her own pulse had climbed in a way she found annoying. She said, "I understand the observation. Do you want to discuss the matter that actually brought me here, or would you prefer more time?" Something shifted in his face. Not much. Something small, like a door that almost opened. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing, which was another choice, and one she noted without giving it the reaction it was probably designed to provoke. He moved toward the desk, but didn't sit behind it. Stood beside it instead, arms crossed, looking at her with that same assessing directness that had nothing in it that she could call personal interest. "You know why you're here," he said. "Merethvale." A pause. "Yes." "You need the grain network. My family needs financial relief. Your chancellor has determined that marriage achieves both outcomes more efficiently than any alternative." She looked at him without any particular expression. "I'm assuming he also presented you with a dossier suggesting that I am unlikely to cause political problems, that my family has no alliances that would complicate your existing relationships, and that my personal reputation is clean enough to satisfy the minimum requirements of public perception." The thing in his face shifted again, slightly. "You've thought about this." "I've had 4 days in a carriage with very little else to think about." He studied her for a moment with what might have been, in another man, something resembling attention. In him it was difficult to categorize. "What do you want from this arrangement?" "The debt's cleared, a position of functional authority over the household management at Ravarin. Reasonable communication about expectations." She paused. "And I want to be treated as someone who lives here, not as a fixture that was installed for administrative purposes." The room was very quiet. "That's a list of demands," he said. "It's a list of minimum viable conditions. I've been careful not to put anything on it that a reasonable man would find unreasonable." She held his gaze. "Is there something on it that you find unreasonable?" The pause before he answered was not long, but it was not short either. "The debts will be cleared within 30 days of the marriage. You will have authority over household management. Communication about expectations I will provide when there are expectations to communicate." He looked at her with that gray, weatherless regard. "The last item I can't promise. You can't promise to treat me as a person who lives here. I can't promise that it will feel the way you intend it to feel. I run this castle the way I run everything else. If you find that tolerable, we proceed. If you don't, there's no point in either of us investing time we don't have." It was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing any man had ever said to her, and also possibly the most brutal. And the fact that it was both simultaneously said something about him that she had not found in any of her research. She said, "I find it tolerable." He nodded once, as if a clause had been agreed to. "The ceremony will be in 3 weeks. You'll return home until then to prepare. Aldrich will handle the financial arrangements." He turned back toward the window, which was as clear a dismissal as anything she had ever received. "You should know that I don't have patience for emotion used as a political tool. If you have something to say to me, say it plainly. I'll respect that. I won't respect anything else." She stood. Her legs were perfectly steady, which she was quietly proud of. "And if I disagree with the decision you've made," she said, "I'll tell you directly." He turned back just slightly, not quite looking at her. "Good. And when I do, I expect to be heard." Now he looked at her, the full weight of that gray regard, which was, she discovered, considerably more significant up close than it had been at the distance of his initial assessment. "We'll see," he said. It was not an agreement, but it was not a refusal. She walked to the door, and when she reached it, she heard him speak again from behind her. "Lady Valecrest." She stopped, did not turn. "You are playing," he said, "but you are not what I expected." She opened the door and left, and the guard outside was very carefully looking at the wall, and she walked back through the corridors of Ravarin Castle with her hands folded in front of her and her back straight, and her pulse doing something complicated that she chose not to examine too closely. They married on a Thursday in early winter. The ceremony was held in the great hall of Ravarin Castle, which was enormous and cold and had been decorated with the absolute minimum of ceremony that could be achieved without it technically being described as bare. There were candles, there were the required witnesses, there were flowers that appeared to have been chosen by someone who was working from a description of flowers without any aesthetic investment in the outcome. Lucien stood at the front of the hall in dark formal dress that fit him with military precision, and when she walked in, he watched her come with the same look he had used in the study, that flat, unreadable assessment. And when she reached him, he said her name once, quietly, as part of the required vows, and that was the most personal thing he said to her during the entire ceremony. She said her own vows clearly, in the steady voice she had been practicing since she was 8 years old, when she had decided that if the world was going to require things of her she found difficult, she was not going to let it see the difficulty. Afterward, there was a formal dinner at which Lucien sat at the head of the table and managed the conversation among his advisors and lords with the competent efficiency of a man conducting a meeting. And Eveline sat beside him and was spoken to perhaps 4 times in 3 hours, twice by Aldrich, who was making an effort, and twice by an older lord from the Western Holdings who was either genuinely interested in her family history or was very good at making conversation with people who were being ignored at their own wedding dinner. She ate everything on her plate. She drank 1 glass of wine and declined a second. She listened to the conversations around her with the specific quality of attention that looked like polite inattention, cataloging everyone at the table with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to the estate accounts. That night, Lucien came to her rooms because that was the expectation, and he was, above all other things, a man who met expectations he had committed to, and the encounter between them was something she chose afterward to regard with the same detached practicality with which she had regarded the rest of the day. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He was present in the specific way that some men understood duty to require presence without requiring anything else, and when it was over he left without ceremony, and she lay in the dark in the bed that was still somehow too empty despite having been in it, and she listened to the castle settle around her in the way that old stone settles, and she thought, with the clear, precise inventory-taking mind that had never yet learned to stop. This is where you live now. Make it work, but the first month was, professionally speaking, instructive. She learned the castle's rhythms the way she had learned the estate's rhythms, by paying attention to the things that other people had stopped noticing. The kitchens ran on a schedule that had been established 15 years ago and had not been updated despite the fact that the kitchen staff had turned over almost entirely in that time, which created a persistent inefficiency in the morning meal preparation that resulted in the household receiving cold breakfasts approximately 3 days out of 7. The household accounts were managed by a keeper named Oren, who was meticulous but who had been given no budget authority to make minor preventive repairs, which meant that small problems compounded regularly into large, expensive ones. The servants who had been at Ravarin longest moved through the castle with a kind of careful invisibility that she recognized from estates where fear had replaced loyalty as the primary motivating force. None of this was catastrophic. It was rather the accumulated consequence of a man who was extremely competent at running an empire and had simply directed none of that competence toward the domestic interior of his own household, because the domestic interior of his household was not how he kept score. She did not request authority. She had been told she had it, and she exercised it quietly, the way she did everything, starting with the things most likely to produce visible improvement in the shortest time and working outward from there. She fixed the kitchen schedule first, because the cold breakfasts were the kind of daily irritant that ground down morale in ways that were disproportionate to the actual problem. She told the head cook, a large-shouldered woman named Marta, who had the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had worked under too many lords who had ideas and no follow-through, exactly what she intended to change and why. And then she asked Marta what she would change if she had been allowed to. Marta looked at her for a moment with that skeptical expression. Then she talked for 45 minutes. But Lucien did not notice the breakfasts. He was present at the morning meal approximately twice a week, the other mornings being occupied by military briefings or strategic correspondence or the various crises of administration that attended the running of a northern empire in winter. And when he was present, he ate with the focused efficiency of a man refueling, giving no apparent attention to what he was eating or the temperature at which it arrived. He noticed other things. He noticed in the second week that the East Wing hallway was being used as a storage corridor for furniture that had apparently been sitting there for years and was now being systematically evaluated by his wife, piece by piece, with the help of two of the younger servants, and that the furniture was being either restored and redistributed or moved to storage more appropriate to its condition. He did not comment on this. He noticed in the third week that two of the household servants who had previously moved through the castle with that particular careful invisibility were now moving through it differently, not boldly, not dramatically, but with a slight recalibration of posture that suggested they had been spoken to by someone who treated them as people worth speaking to. He also did not comment on this. What he did, twice in that first month, was arrive at a doorway and find Eveline already there. Once in the corridor outside the accounts room where she was discussing something with Oren over a ledger spread between them, and once in the library where she was reading one of his own books at a table near the fire and looked up when he entered with the same calm steadiness she had deployed in his study 3 weeks before. Both times he stopped for exactly a moment. Both times he moved on without speaking. He told himself this was normal. Adjusting to the presence of another person in a space that had previously contained only him was a practical matter of recalibration, nothing more. He had made a political decision, and it had proceeded as planned. The estate was running slightly more smoothly. The breakfast was warmer. He had no particular feelings about either of these facts. He had absolutely no particular feelings about the woman reading his books in his library. Imant. The letter arrived in the 5th week. It came from the south, from a house whose seal Eveline recognized before she even broke the wax. House Morkant, the blue-gray crest of the northern wing of the Morkant family, which controlled the coastal trade routes and had been, according to everything she had read about current political alignments in Valedorn, in a quiet contest with D'Artois influence for the last 4 years. The letter was addressed to Lucien. It had been delivered to the castle by a Morkant courier who had been, according to Master Fenwick's report, impeccably polite and had requested a response by end of the month. She did not open it. She set it on Lucien's desk in his study, precisely centered, which was the only kind of statement she could make in this particular situation. That evening, Lucien was late to dinner and arrived at the table with the specific quality of stillness that she had begun to recognize as his version of preoccupation. A tightening of some internal system that was usually invisible but occasionally surfaced in the set of his jaw and the absence of his usual clipped conversational efficiency. They ate in silence for several minutes. This was not unusual. Their dinners were frequently largely silent, not as an expression of hostility, but because neither of them was interested in conversation for its own sake, which was one of the few things they had immediately in common. Then Lucien said, without preamble, "You saw the letter. Fenwick told me who it was from. I didn't open it." "I know you didn't." He picked up his wine, looked at it, set it down. "Morkant is proposing an alliance, a trade agreement, publicly. Privately, it's a proposal to reorganize the eastern grain distribution in a way that routes it through Morkant Coastal Holdings, which would make the Mirethvale network substantially less strategically significant." He looked at her. Yes. Which is presumably why they've waited until after the marriage to make the proposal. Another pause. Slightly longer. They assume that the marriage removes the immediacy of my need to control the network independently. Does it? He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. No. She looked down at her plate and then back up. Are you going to tell me how you plan to respond to it? Why would I? Because the management of Mirithvale is now technically part of my household responsibility, and because any proposal that affects its strategic value affects the political position of our marriage, and because you told me you'd treat me as someone who lives here. She met his gaze without emphasis or pressure. I'm not asking you to take my counsel if you don't want it. I'm asking if you intend to inform me of decisions that affect my position in this household. The room was quiet. The fire made its sounds. The network stays independent, he said. I'll decline the trade agreement through Aldrich. It will be framed as a scheduling matter to give Morcant time to accept the refusal without losing face, which is the only thing that prevents a refusal from becoming a provocation. She considered this. That's well handled. He said nothing, but something in the angle of his attention shifted fractionally. The part I'd be careful about, she said, keeping her voice even, is the timing of the framing. If Aldrich's letter arrives while the Morcant delegation is traveling to the capital for the spring assembly, it will read as calculated dismissal regardless of the phrasing. Morcant will know you timed it to deny them any opportunity for immediate response. Lucien looked at her. Send the response before their delegation departs, she said. Let them receive it on their home ground, with time to consider. It gives you the advantage of appearing deliberate rather than reactive, and it leaves them no clean grounds for public grievance. The silence lasted long enough that she began to wonder if she had misjudged the moment. Then Lucien said, Aldrich is currently planning to send the letter in 10 days. I know. I saw the draft on his desk when I was reviewing the household correspondence. You reviewed the household correspondence. It's my household. Something moved across his face. Not warmth exactly, not amusement exactly. Something that occupied the space between those two things and had no name in his vocabulary. He picked up his wine again, and this time drank it. I'll tell Aldrich to send it within the week, he said. What? She found her rhythms in Rivarin as winter deepened and the world outside the castle walls became a study in white and gray and the specific silence of heavy snowfall. She learned the castle the way she learned everything, systematically, in pieces, each piece placed in relation to the others until the whole shape emerged. She learned which servants were genuinely loyal and which were loyal specifically to the previous master's methods, and were quietly resistant to any change that hadn't been directly ordered by the Duke himself. She learned which rooms held cold in ways that no amount of fire corrected, because their stone was too thick and their positioning too deep in the north face of the castle, and she moved certain household operations accordingly without making it a point of principle. She learned the library, which was large and not particularly well organized, and which contained books in 4 languages, including 2. She read in one she was learning specifically because she had found a text in it that she suspected contained detailed records of the northern border negotiations of 60 years ago and which might be relevant to understanding the current political landscape. She was 2/3 through the border negotiation text, one evening in the 7th week when she fell asleep in the chair by the fire. She did not hear Lucien come in. He had come for the atlas that he kept on the 3rd shelf from the left, a military atlas with margin notes in his own hand, updated over 10 years of strategic work, which he needed for the morning briefing. He had come at 11 at night because he had been in his study until 11 and needed the atlas before he could sleep, and he had not expected anyone in the library because no one was ever in the library at 11 at night. He stopped 2 steps inside the door. She was in the chair that he used himself, the large one near the fire, and she was asleep with a book open in her lap, and her head tipped slightly sideways against the chair back, and the firelight was doing something to her face that afternoon light and formal posture and the critical distance of their usual interactions had never done. He stood there for a moment. He was not a man who was interrupted by things. He had built his entire adult life on the premise that interruption was a failure of attention, that the world presented itself as it was, and it was your job to remain clear-eyed in the face of it. He had looked at his wife in a study 3 months ago and made an accurate assessment and proceeded accordingly, and the assessment had been correct in every way that mattered, and he had no cause to revisit it. The firelight moved. Her face without the glasses was, he did not have the right word immediately. He had a substantial vocabulary, but it had been developed primarily for military and political purposes, and it did not contain language adequate to what was happening in the 3 seconds he stood in the doorway of his own library and looked at his wife asleep in his chair. He got the atlas. He did it quietly because waking her served no purpose, and he walked back toward the door and did not look at her again, because looking at her again also served no purpose. And both of those statements were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. And he was still working out what to do with the part that wasn't the whole truth when he was back in his study with the atlas open in front of him and the fire burning low and his mind doing something it had not done since he was young, which was refusing to stay where he put it. The pregnancy announced itself in the 10th week. Eveline had suspected for 2 weeks before the confirmation and had spent those 2 weeks doing exactly what she did with most things that alarmed her, which was to continue functioning at her usual level of efficiency while allowing the alarm to exist in a sealed interior compartment that she checked occasionally with the clinical detachment of a physician examining someone else's symptoms. She told Lucien at breakfast, on a morning when the snow outside was particularly heavy and the warming breakfast Marta had been reliably producing for 6 weeks was set in front of them both with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been acknowledged. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. Lucien's response was a silence that lasted approximately 3 seconds, and then, "Good." She looked at him. "Good. It secures the succession. It will strengthen our political position significantly before the spring assembly." He reached for his coffee, and the gesture had the same deliberate efficiency as every other gesture he made, and his voice had the same flat note of competent satisfaction that he used for logistical victories. "I'll have Aldrich inform the necessary parties." She did not say anything else for the rest of the meal. He did not notice this, or if he noticed it, he interpreted it as her usual quiet, which was a reasonable interpretation, and also a profoundly wrong one. And she sat across from him and ate her breakfast in a silence that was, for the first time since she had arrived in Ravarin, not a practical silence, but an interior one, the kind that forms over damage instead of simply over thought. She had known this was a political arrangement. She had known this going in. She had made the calculation herself, in the study of her father's house, with the same clear-eyed practicality with which she made every calculation. She had not known, and this was the specific failure of her planning, the place where her systematic approach had not covered the territory, that something in her had quietly, without consulting the rest of her, begun to allow a different expectation. Not love. She was not that impractical, but something. The word for it was somewhere in the border negotiation text she'd been reading, in a language she was still learning, and she hadn't gotten to it yet. She pushed back her chair and stood. "Excuse me," she said, to no one in particular, and walked out of the breakfast room with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her and her pulse doing the complicated thing again. And this time she did not shut it into the sealed compartment, because the sealed compartment was full, and she was a long way from any room in this enormous castle where she could afford to let it out. She walked through the corridors of Ravarin with the snow coming down outside every window, and she walked until she found a quiet corridor in the north wing where no one was. And she stood in it for exactly 4 minutes, looking at the wall, which was cold stone and completely unhelpful, and then she straightened her spine and turned around and went back to work. She was still doing this, pushing it into the part of herself where practicality lived and grief did not, when 3 days later a letter arrived from House Aldenmore that made Aldrich go pale when he read it, and which he brought to Lucien's study, and which Lucien read twice before he sent for Eveline, and told her with the same flat directness he used for everything that there was a threat she needed to know about. But that wasn't what changed everything. What changed everything arrived 4 days after that, in the form of an invitation, embossed, formal, sealed in the white and silver crest of the imperial house, to the royal winter ball, where the entire empire would assemble, and where Eveline d'Artois, Duchess of Ravarin, would be presented to the court for the first time, and where someone had already been making very specific plans about what that presentation would look like, and what it would cost her. The invitation sat on Lucien's desk for 2 days before he addressed it, Eveline knew this because she passed his study twice daily on her way to the household accounts room, and both times the door was open, the precise width that indicated he was working inside but had not yet required privacy, and both times she could see the white and silver envelope on the corner of the desk, untouched, in the specific position of something that had been set aside not from negligence but from deliberate deferral. On the morning of the third day, she found it on her own desk. No note, no instruction, just the envelope, repositioned with the kind of precision that was either a statement or simply the way Lucien handled everything, and which she had not yet learned to distinguish. She opened it. The Royal Winter Ball. 4 weeks. The full imperial court assembled at the capital, Valadorn's great families and their satellites and their enemies, arranged in one ballroom for the season's most consequential performance. The invitation was addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ravarin, which was the first time she had seen that title applied to her in official correspondence, and she sat with it in her hands for a moment and felt the weight of it settle into the space between her ribs where useful fear lived. She had been to court exactly once before, at 17, for a minor function her father had brought her to in one of his periodic efforts to integrate her into the world he still believed would value her appropriately if she was simply presented correctly. She remembered the way the room had arranged itself by invisible architecture, who stood near whom, who turned away from whom, the specific geometry of ambition that organized noble social spaces. She remembered feeling like she was watching a language being spoken that she understood intellectually but had never learned to speak herself. She was 24 now. She had spent 7 years since then learning a great many things. She put the invitation in her correspondence folder and went to find Lucien. He was in the weapons courtyard despite the cold, which she had observed was where he went when something was working itself out in him that couldn't be resolved at a desk. He was not sparring. He was alone, working through a form with a practiced sword, and the precision of it was the same precision he brought to everything, controlled and exact. But there was something in the pace of it that was working harder than precision required. She stood at the courtyard entrance and waited. He saw her when he turned on the fourth pass. He finished the sequence before he stopped. "The invitation," she said. "Yes." "You want to discuss it. I want you to understand what you're walking into." He lowered the practice sword and looked at her with that direct regard that still, 10 weeks into their marriage, landed with more force than she expected. The Winter Ball is not a social event. It's a political assessment. Every house with a grievance against Ravarin will have representatives there. Every lord who is undecided about where to align in the spring assembly will be watching every interaction I have to determine whether the D'Artois position is stronger or weaker than it was last season. And my presence complicates that. Your presence is new information they don't have a position on yet. New information is exploitable. He walked toward her, stopping at the appropriate distance, and the cold was coming off him with the exertion of the workout. Morcant will be there. His full delegation. He has been publicly dismissive of this marriage since Aldrich sent the refusal, and he will look for any leverage he can create. You mean he'll look for ways to make me look inadequate? He'll look for ways to make you look like a liability. Lucien's voice was flat, factual. A plain wife from a bankrupt family who doesn't know the court. That's a story he can use. If he can make that story stick in public with the right audience, it creates an impression of D'Artois weakness that affects the spring negotiations before they've started. She looked at him steadily. You're telling me this so I can prepare. I'm telling you this so you understand the stakes and don't walk in assuming it's going to be a function. I've never assumed anything was a function. Something in his jaw shifted slightly. I know that. She studied him for a moment. The cold had pinked the edges of his face in a way that made him look briefly like something other than a strategic instrument of northern imperial power, and she filed this observation in the interior place where she kept the things she had noticed about him that didn't fit the initial assessment and was choosing not to examine too closely. I'll be ready, she said. I need more than ready. I know what you need. She held his gaze. You need me to walk into that room and not give Morcant anything to work with. You need me to be present in a way that costs you nothing politically. A pause. I understand the requirement. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that wasn't quite readable. Good. he said. She turned to leave. Eveline. She stopped. If anyone approaches you in a way that feels like pressure, he said, you leave the conversation. You don't engage. You find Aldrich or you find me. She turned back just enough to look at him over her shoulder. And if I'm in the middle of a conversation that's going well and you don't like who it's with? The pause before his answer had a quality she hadn't heard before. Then I trust your judgment. She walked back inside. The preparation for the ball consumed the next 3 weeks in ways that overlapped her regular household management with the specific logistical weight of public presentation, and she moved through both simultaneously with the concentrated efficiency of someone who had decided that the only response to a high-stakes situation was to be more prepared than everyone else in the room. She wrote letters. She wrote to the 2 court ladies of her acquaintance, distant acquaintance, the kind maintained by occasional correspondence rather than real familiarity, and asked careful questions about the current social topography of the Capitol Court. Who had risen in the last season? Who had fallen? What alliances were visible and which were operating below surface? The letters she received back were full of the kind of careful indirection that court correspondence always favored, but she read the indirection as clearly as she read the direct statements, and by the end of the second week she had a working map of the room she would be walking into. She also, on the 14th day, when the accounts were balanced and the household was running with the smooth efficiency she had spent 10 weeks building into it, sat down at the small writing desk in her rooms and spent 3 hours thinking about her appearance. This was not something she did often. She had spent most of her life operating on the premise that her appearance was a fixed variable, present, functional, not particularly useful as a strategic asset. She wore what she owned. She kept it clean and well-maintained. She had never put significant resources toward the project of being looked at, because the project had always seemed to cost more than it returned. The ball was a different calculation. She wrote a list. She crossed things out. She rewrote them. By the end, she had a clear picture of what she needed and what it would cost and where to source it, and she took the list to Aldrich the following morning and handed it to him. Aldrich read it with the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this for some time and was relieved to finally be dealing with it. "I'll see to it," he said. "I need the gown finished before we travel. I need 3 days at minimum for final adjustments. I'll instruct accordingly. And Aldrich," she met his eyes, "don't tell the Duke the specifics." Aldrich looked at her over the list. "He may ask. If he asks, tell him the preparations are in hand." She kept her voice even. "I want him to see the result, not the process." Aldrich held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating an assessment. "As you wish, my lady," he said. Tim. They traveled to the capital in the Duke's formal convoy. 6 carriages, mounted guard, the full ceremony of D'Artois, rank in motion through the winter roads. And Lucien rode outside for the first 2 days and joined her in the carriage on the 3rd, when the weather turned truly vicious, and even his tolerance for cold apparently had limits he hadn't publicized. He sat across from her and read dispatches. She read her border history text, which she had finally translated sufficiently to confirm that it did in fact contain the negotiation record she had suspected, along with several passages that were directly relevant to current Morcant territorial claims if anyone had been paying attention in the past 60 years. On the second evening in the carriage, when the sky outside had gone fully dark and the convoy had stopped for the night at a way-station inn, Lucien set down the dispatch he was reading and said, without apparent preamble, "The pregnancy." She looked up. "How are you?" The question arrived in his voice with the specific quality of something that had been sitting unaddressed for some time and had finally been allowed out. Not warm, exactly, but not the clinical satisfaction he had deployed at breakfast 6 weeks ago. Something that occupied different territory. "I'm well," she said. "The physician is satisfied. There's nothing to be concerned about. You've been working the same schedule. The work isn't strenuous. I'm not talking about strenuous." He held her gaze. "I'm talking about whether you're all right." She looked at him for a moment with the measuring look she usually kept more concealed. "You didn't ask that question 6 weeks ago," she said. A silence. He did not look away. "No. What's different now?" He looked at her, and something in the quality of it was different from the catalog of looks she had been compiling since the study meeting. Not assessment, not the flat regard of political calculation. Something that had no established name in his habitual expression and appeared to be new to his face as much as to her observation. "I was wrong," he said, "about how I responded." The carriage rocked slightly on the road. The fire in the small lantern swayed. She said, "I know." "That's all you're going to say." "What else would you like me to say?" He looked at his hands for a moment, which was something she had never seen him do. "I don't know," he said, with an honesty that surprised her into stillness. "I'm not familiar with the territory." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved against the carriage walls with the sound of something patient and enormous. "I'm all right," she said finally. "I'm better than all right in most of the ways that matter. I've made something functional out of Ravarin that I'm proud of, and I'm carrying a child, and I'm going to a ball where someone wants to diminish me publicly, and I have no intention of letting him." She held his gaze. "Those are the facts of my situation. The only thing I need from you is for you to be in the room when it matters." He looked at her. "I'll be in the room," he said. A note. The capital in winter was a different creature than the north, where Ravarin was stone and silence and the specific austere beauty of a place that had no patience for ornament. The capital was lit and layered and loud, and the streets near the imperial quarter were full of convoy after convoy, delivering noble families to their city residences in preparation for the ball, the cold air carrying the sounds of horses and servants, and the specific compressed anxiety of people performing importance. Their city residence was a townhouse maintained by the D'Artois estate, with the same functional precision as everything Lucien owned, and Eveline had 24 hours in it before the ball, during which she completed her preparations with the concentrated focus of someone who had been planning this for 3 weeks and was not going to allow nervousness to interfere with execution. The gown was deep green, the color of winter pine before snow, and it had been made by a dressmaker Aldrich had sourced from a recommendation in one of Eveline's court letters, and it fit her with the precision of something that had been built around her specific measurements rather than adapted from an existing form. It was not elaborate. It was exact. There was a difference, and the dressmaker had understood it. She stood in front of the mirror in her dressing room the evening of the ball and looked at herself with the same clear-eyed assessment she applied to everything, and what she saw was not the woman who had walked into Lucien's study in her best remade dress. The structure was the same. The glasses were the same. The face behind them was the same face it had always been, which she had never had any particular feeling about, positive or negative. She thought about taking the glasses off for the evening. She thought about it for exactly 90 seconds, and then she decided. And the decision had nothing to do with vanity or strategy and everything to do with the specific quality of resolve she had developed at age 8 in her father's house when she had decided that the world's requirements of her were not going to determine what she required of herself. She would wear the glasses. She was not hiding them. She was not performing anything. She would walk into that room as exactly who she was, and if that was insufficient for the court of Valadorn, then the court of Valadorn would have to find a way to live with its own insufficiency. She went to find Lucien. He was in the entrance hall, already dressed, talking to Aldrich in the low, rapid cadence that meant final briefing. He turned when she came down the stairs, and she watched the thing happen on his face that she had seen in the library and had been waiting, without admitting she was waiting, to see again. It was brief. He controlled it almost immediately. But it was there. He said nothing about the gown. He offered his arm. She took it. But the ballroom was exactly what the capital always made the ballroom. Enormous, overlit, organized by invisible forces into configurations that looked social and were entirely political. Chandeliers threw their light across 100 conversations happening in the formal language of people who were all watching everyone else while appearing to watch no one. They entered together, and the room did what rooms did when Lucien D'Artois entered. A ripple of recalibration, people turning fractionally, conversations lowering and then restoring themselves, the subtle collective assessment of a court determining what the evening's most powerful variable was going to do. And then a secondary ripple, quieter, as the assessment extended to the woman on his arm. She felt it the way you feel weather, not as individual drops, but as a change in pressure. The looking, the recalibration. Some of it curious, some calculating. Some, and she identified these with precise accuracy, hostile. Lucien moved them through the room with the fluid authority of a man who had done this many times and found it beneath his full attention, stopping to speak with a lord here, acknowledging a general there. The minimum required social performance of a man who was present by obligation and sovereign by nature. For the first 40 minutes, no one spoke to her directly. This was not an accident. She knew the mechanics of it, the deliberate social omission that sent its own message, the way ignoring someone in a room of this size was as communicative as addressing them. She ate a canapé. She watched the room. She identified the Morcant delegation in the third quarter of the space, clustered near the eastern windows with the comfortable density of people who expected the evening to go in a particular direction. Duke Cassian Morcant himself was younger than she had expected. 35, perhaps, with the kind of effortless physical confidence that came either from genuine self-possession or from having lived his entire life in rooms where everyone deferred to him. He was watching Lucien across the room with a patience that felt like preparation, and then he looked at her. She held the look for a half-second, then turned away. Lucien had been pulled into a conversation with 3 lords from the Western Coalition, and she could read from the set of his back that this was the spring assembly, maneuvering beginning early, and that he was not going to be extractable in the next quarter hour. Aldrich was on the far side of the room managing a conversation with a Treasury official. She was, for the first time this evening, standing alone. Cassian Morcant separated from his delegation and moved toward her with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided how this conversation was going to end before he started walking. Lady Valecrest, he said, and the deliberate use of her unmarried name was so precise it was almost elegant. Lady D'Artois, she said, with the same tone he had used, and watched the micro-adjustment in his expression. He smiled. Of course, forgive me. I've had some trouble remembering the change, I'm afraid. You're not quite what one pictures when one hears the name D'Artois. Around them, a circle of social space had opened in the way that social space opens when a performance is about to occur and the audience is too well-bred to appear to be watching. She looked at him with the same clear, settled regard she had deployed on Lucien in his study the first day. I imagine that's true, she said pleasantly. The name carries considerable weight. I suppose anything beside it looks insufficient if you decide in advance that it will. Something shifted in his eyes. He had expected she could read it, either deference or indignation, and had prepared for both. He had not prepared for this. You've been quite the topic of conversation since the marriage was announced, he said, recalibrating. Ravarin's quiet little remedy for a financial inconvenience, very practical of D'Artois, very economic, she said. Yes, the grain network was the primary consideration. I imagine that's frustrating for you. You made a proposal assuming the network would be available and found it wasn't. She tilted her head very slightly. Has the spring trade plan been adjusted, or is House Morcant still working from last season's projections? The silence around them had a texture now. Cassian Morcant looked at her with something that was recalibrating from condescension towards something more careful, and she could see him deciding whether to escalate or retreat, and she watched him decide on escalation. He reached out and touched her arm. Not aggressively, socially. The kind of touch that established contact without appearing to. The kind that said, I am choosing to make this physical, and there is nothing you can do about that in this room without making it a scene. You're quite remarkable, he said, and the word remarkable had nothing of a compliment in it. For what you are. Across the room, the conversation with the Western lords had apparently concluded. Lucien turned. Babs. She felt the change in the room before she saw him move. The specific shift of attention that traveled across a social space when something with genuine force began moving through it. She did not look toward him. She kept her eyes on Cassian Morcant and watched him see Lucien coming and watched the calculation in his face decide wrongly that this was a winnable moment if he held the position. Lucien arrived beside her and did not look at Morcant immediately. He looked at Eveline, and in the 3 seconds of that look she saw something she had not seen on his face before. Not the unreadable assessment, not the fractional shifts she had been cataloging for weeks. Something open. Something that had gotten past the controlled system that managed everything else. Then he looked at Morcant. The sound of the ballroom continued. The music continued. None of that stopped, and yet the immediate space around the three of them had gone absolutely still in the way of a held breath. "Cassian," Lucien said. One word, flat as a blade. Morcant withdrew his hand from her arm. "Lucien, I was just getting acquainted with your wife. Charming woman. You've kept her very—" "You're going to want to choose the next word carefully," Lucien said. The quality of his voice was something she had not heard before. Not anger exactly. Something below anger, more elemental. The kind of thing that lived underneath anger in men who were built the way he was built. It had a temperature. It was cold. Morcant looked at him, and the calculation in his face was running fast, and she watched it arrive at the same conclusion she had already arrived at, which was that the room had shifted on him without his permission, and he was no longer holding the position he thought he was. "I meant no disrespect," Morcant said, and the retreat was dressed up, but it was retreat, and everyone in the immediate radius knew it. "I know exactly what you meant." Lucien's hand had moved to the small of her back, and the touch was different in kind from Morcant's. It was not a claim the way Morcant's had been a claim. It was something she lacked the immediate vocabulary for, some physical declaration that had gotten out before the controlled system could intercept it. "And I know what you mean to do at the spring assembly, and I need you to understand that you are going to find that considerably more difficult than you've planned for." Morcant held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he inclined his head with the precise minimum of courtesy and turned back toward his delegation. The held breath released. The room's volume recalibrated. The performance had concluded. Lucien did not move his hand from her back. She stood very still. Around her the ball continued. Music, conversation, the complex geometry of 100 political calculations in motion, and the hand at the small of her back was a point of specific heat in the cold of everything else. And she was managing with her last reserves of the systematic practicality that had gotten her through 24 years and 10 weeks of Rivarin, not to let herself understand yet what it meant. She said, very quietly, so only he could hear, "You didn't have to do that." His voice, just as quiet, just behind her ear. "I know." A pause. "Then why?" "Because," he said, and stopped, and the words sat there between them unfinished, and she understood suddenly with the specific clarity of something that had been building without her permission for weeks, in the library, in the carriage, in the question he had asked about whether she was all right, that the word was unfinished not because he didn't know the answer, but because he had just, in the middle of a ballroom before half the empire, arrived at it for the first time himself, and it terrified him. She turned to look at him. His face was the face she had been studying for 10 weeks. Controlled, precise, the architecture of a man who had built himself specifically against being moved. And underneath it, visible for the first time in the specific way that a crack in stone is visible, something that had not been there before. She looked at him. He looked at her, and she understood, with the full weight of everything her systematic mind was capable of, that this was the moment neither of them could take back. They did not speak about it that night. The ball continued for 3 more hours after the moment with Morcant, and they moved through those hours in the careful parallel of 2 people who had both understood that something had shifted and had arrived by separate routes at the same decision, which was to let the evening finish before they dealt with what the evening had produced. Lucien spoke with lords. She spoke with their wives, more usefully than he knew, filing information with the systematic attention that never stopped running underneath whatever surface she was presenting. They stood together twice more in the course of the evening, close enough that the room could read it as a unified front. And each time she was aware of the specific quality of his attention, not the political attention he deployed on everyone else, something that had a different weight. In the carriage back to the townhouse, they sat in silence that was different from the silence of the journey to the capital. That silence had been 2 people working. This was 2 people not yet ready to work with what they were carrying. He said, at the door to her rooms, "Get some sleep." She said, "You too." He went to his rooms. She went to hers. She lay in the dark for a long time and did not sleep, and in the morning neither of them referenced the previous evening directly, and they began the process of returning to Ravarin with the careful efficiency of people who had decided, without discussing it, that the ground beneath them needed to be stable before anyone tested what it would hold. The first 3 weeks back were, on the surface, the most functional they had been. Something had reorganized between them without being named, and the reorganization expressed itself in small practical ways. He began stopping in the household accounts room in the evenings on his way back from the study, not to review the work, but apparently simply because the room was on the route. And occasionally he stayed long enough to drink the coffee that appeared there reliably at 9 o'clock. And occasionally he talked. Not warmly, not with the new openness she had glimpsed in the ballroom, but with the specific directness he used when he had decided to include someone in his actual thinking rather than just his conclusions. And she understood that for him, this was as close to warmth as the architecture currently allowed. She received it as what it was. She also received, in the second week back, 2 letters from court acquaintances that contained information she had been waiting for since the ball. The specific names of lords who had watched the Morcant confrontation and had been, according to carefully worded social intelligence, recalibrating their spring assembly positions in directions that favored D'Artois' interests. She brought this to Lucien. He read the letters, looked at her, and said, "How long have you been running correspondence with court contacts?" "Since before the ball." "On your own authority?" "On my own initiative. There's a difference." She met his gaze. "The household authority you gave me doesn't technically extend to political intelligence gathering. I operated on the premise that you'd rather have the information than a clean chain of authorization." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that occupied the space between readable and not. "You were right," he said. She nodded, and something in the careful interior accounting she had been keeping since the carriage journey ticked over one line item and settled. It was Aldrich who broke. She did not see it coming, and that was the fact that would live in her the longest. Not the betrayal itself, but the blindness preceding it. She had spent 12 weeks cataloging Ravarin's variables, building her map of the household and the political landscape and the human systems that ran both. And she had missed this because she had made the specific error of extending trust to the one person she had trusted completely. Aldrich had been at Ravarin for 30 years. He had served Lucien's father. He had managed the D'Artois administrative apparatus with the loyal precision of a man who had made the estate his life's work, and she had read him from her first week as the most reliable fixed point in an environment that had several unfixed ones. She had been wrong about one thing. The loyalty was real. It had simply been redirected. She found out the way consequential things often surface, sideways, through something that was not itself the discovery. She had asked Oren, the accounts keeper, to pull the records of the Mirith Vale grain network transfers for the last 2 years. A routine review, the kind she did quarterly now, checking for the kind of slow administrative drift that accumulated when systems were not regularly audited. Oren brought the records, and then, with the hesitation of a man who had been deciding for some time whether to say something, said, "My lady, there is a discrepancy in the fourth quarter transfers that I flagged for the Chancellor 6 weeks ago. I have not received a response, and the figure has not been corrected." She looked at the records. The discrepancy was not large enough to be immediately visible without looking for it. It was the kind of number that disappeared into a complex ledger if you were reading for the total rather than the line items. But it pointed, with the specific precision of something left intentionally pointing, to a secondary account she did not recognize. She said, keeping her voice level, "Did you document the flag you sent to the Chancellor?" "Yes, my lady. I keep copies of all correspondence." "Bring me the copy." She sat with the copy of Oren's flag and the account records for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, the shape of what she was looking at assembled itself with the horrible clarity of something that had been there all along. The secondary account was a Morcant account. A shell, probably. Something buffered enough that a surface examination would not connect it immediately. But the routing numbers in the transfer records were the specific format used by Morcant coastal banking houses. And she had memorized enough of the Morcant financial architecture during her pre-ball research to read this the way you read a signature. Aldrich had been diverting grain network revenue to Morcant for at least a year. She sat very still. The fire in the accounts room burned. The numbers on the page held their positions. Outside, Ravarin went about its afternoon with no awareness of the fact that the ground had just opened. She thought about the Morcant proposal that had arrived in the 5th week of her marriage, the one Aldrich had brought to Lucien's desk, the one that she had helped Lucien time the refusal on, carefully, to deny Morcant grounds for public grievance. Aldrich had written the refusal. Aldrich had known the timing strategy because she had set it at the dinner table with Aldrich's draft already in mind, and Aldrich had been in the room. She thought about every piece of strategic information she had discussed in Lucien's study with both of them present. The spring assembly positions, the Western Coalition assessment, the correspondence from her court contacts. She had brought all of it to Lucien directly, and Aldrich had been in the room for most of those conversations because Aldrich was always in the room for strategic conversations. That was his role. That was how she had trusted him. She put the records down and stood up. She went to Lucien's study and closed the door behind her. He looked up from the dispatch he was reading and read her face, or read something in it, because what was on her face was not the usual settled composure, and he had been paying enough attention in recent weeks to know the difference. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." She put the account records on his desk and the copy of Oren's flag and stood back. "Read the 4th quarter transfers. Look at the secondary account in the 3rd column. Then look at the routing number." She watched him read. She watched the stillness that came over him. The specific quality of stillness that was not peace, but its opposite. The kind that happened when a man who processed at high speed arrived at a destination he had not expected. He sat with it for longer than she expected. Longer, maybe, than she would have. The dispatch he'd been reading sat to his left, forgotten, and the fire behind him made his shadow very straight and very long across the floor. "Aldrich," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "For how long?" "At minimum, a year based on these records. Possibly longer. This is what's visible in the grain network. I don't know yet what else there might be." The silence had a weight in it that she could feel physically, like pressure in a closed room. "You're sure," he said. "The routing numbers are Morcant coastal banking format. I'd recognize them wrong in a different direction, but not this direction." She paused. "I'm sorry." He looked up at that. The look was not what she expected. Not rage, not the controlled beneath control thing she had seen directed at Morcant in the ballroom. Something rawer. Something that had gotten further past the system before the system could manage it. "Don't apologize," he said. "This is not—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "This is not your failure." "I know. I'm not apologizing for the failure. I'm apologizing because you're going to have to do something very hard, and I wish it wasn't necessary." He stood up. He walked to the window. The same window he had stood at when she first walked into this room 4 months ago, when he had looked at her and said something cruel with the flatness of a man stating facts, and she had stood in the space after it and responded with the only weapon she had available, which was clarity. He stood with his back to her for a long time. She waited. "He advised my father," Lucien said finally, to the window. "He was in this castle before I was born." She said nothing. "He handled my father's estate when I was campaigning north, when I was 23 and the empire was trying to eat itself, and I needed someone here I could trust without having to verify." He turned around. His face was the controlled face, the architectural face, but something underneath it was moving in a way that changed the quality of the control, made it effortful rather than natural. "He was the only person in this castle I have never verified." "I know." "Because you don't verify the things you've already decided are fixed." She looked at him steadily. "No, you don't." He held her gaze, and in it she saw the specific thing that long-held assumptions leave behind when they're removed, not just the absence of the assumption, but the exposure of the place it had been covering, the load-bearing damage beneath. "How do you want to handle this?" he said, quietly. "Aldrich doesn't know I've found it yet. If we move carefully, we can get a full accounting of the damage before he has any reason to move money or destroy records. And then it's your decision." She held his gaze. "But I'd recommend making it in a way that gives you what you need from him before you remove him. He knows things about the Morcant operation that could be more valuable than the satisfaction of an immediate response. He looked at her for a long moment. "You've already thought through the sequence," he said. "I had 20 minutes with the records before I came to you. I think better when I'm moving." Something in his face, not a smile exactly, something adjacent to it that lived in the same neighborhood. "So do I," he said. "Then, come back tonight, after dinner. Bring everything Oren has." "I'll be here." She turned toward the door. "Eveline?" She stopped. "Don't tell anyone else yet." His voice had settled back into its operational register, the flat efficiency of a man who had accepted the situation and was now moving through it. But underneath it, faint as a structural crack, something that had not been there 4 months ago. "Not even Fenwick, not yet." "I know how to keep this." "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm telling you, instead of telling you not to worry about it." She left. They worked until 2 in the morning. The full accounting, when assembled, was worse than the grain network alone had suggested. Aldrich had been systematic and careful and had operated on the correct assumption that no one would look closely at the administrative overlap between the household accounts and the external estate transfers, because no one ever had. He had been right for a long time. He had stopped being right when Eveline arrived and started looking at everything. The total diversion over an estimated 18 months ran to roughly a quarter of the grain network's annual revenue, redirected through 3 separate channels to Morcant-connected accounts. There was also evidence, less conclusive but structurally suggestive, that strategic information about D'Artois negotiating positions had been shared. The timing of specific Morcant moves correlated too precisely with conversations that had only one consistent attendee beyond Lucien himself. Lucien sat with this for a long time without speaking. She watched him process it and thought about what it cost to discover that the map of your loyalties had been wrong in the place you were most certain of, and she did not offer comfort because comfort was not what the moment required. What the moment required was exactly what she had given him, which was the truth and the tools and the space to decide what to do with both. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "Yes. I'll have Fenwick bring him to the study in the morning. Private. No other staff present." He looked at the assembled records. "I want the full confrontation on record before we move to the external implications." "The external implications are going to move fast once Morcant realizes the channel is closed." "I know." He looked at her. "Which means we have a window, a short one." "How short?" "Days, not weeks. Once Aldrich knows we have this, Morcant will know within 48 hours regardless of what Aldrich promises me in that room." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The old stone ceiling with the smoke-darkened surface that she had learned he looked at when he was working something difficult. "Which means the spring assembly positioning has to move before then. The lords who were recalibrating after the ball, I need them committed before Morcant can run a counter-narrative about D'Artois' internal instability. You have the letters I gave you. 3 of them indicated they were waiting for a direct approach. I can't send Aldrich." She met his eyes. "No," she said. "You can't." The silence between them held the weight of what wasn't being said yet, and she could see him arriving at it. The specific shape of a man who had spent his entire adult life building a system that ran through one trusted point, discovering that the point was compromised, and that the system's survival now required a restructuring he had not planned for and could not do alone. He looked at her. She looked back. "The household authority," he said, "has always technically been household only. I'm expanding it." She did not react visibly, which was the right response, and also, she recognized with the clear interior honesty she extended only to herself, required more discipline in this moment than most things had required from her in a long time. "Aldrich's administrative function," she said, "the correspondence, the external contacts management, everything he touched. That's a significant transfer." "I'm aware." "Lucien." She said his name without armor on it, which was something she had not done before, and she felt them both register it. "This isn't just administrative. If I take Aldrich's function, the court will read it as a political elevation. It changes what I am in this empire. It changes what our marriage looks like from the outside." He held her gaze without flinching. I know what it changes. And you're decided. I've been decided about considerably more than the administrative function for longer than I've been comfortable with, he said, and it was the most direct thing he had ever said to her. And it landed in the interior place she had been keeping sealed for 12 weeks, with the force of something the seal was no longer quite adequate to contain. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. She gathered the records from the table and put them in the secure case she had brought. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She stood to leave, and she was at the door when the pain started. It was not dramatic at first. A tightening, low and deep, that she tried in the first second to categorize as fatigue, 12 weeks of pregnancy, 2 in the morning, 6 hours at a desk in a cold study. She stood with her hand on the door frame and tried to breathe through it. Then it got worse. Eveline, Lucien's voice, sharp and immediate, from behind her. She turned, and she must have been showing something on her face because he was already standing, already moving, and she said, with the last available fragment of systematic calm, I think... She didn't finish the sentence. He crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her before she reached the floor, and the records case hit the stone with a sound like something breaking, and she was aware of his voice saying her name with a quality in it she had never heard before. Nothing controlled in it, nothing managed, just the raw sound of a man for whom the system that ran everything had just failed in the only direction that mattered. And the pain was a white pressure that erased the room around the edges. And the last clear thing she thought before everything narrowed to the center was that she had not, in all her systematic preparation for every contingency of this marriage, prepared adequately for this. And that she was afraid. He carried her through the castle himself. He did not wait for servants. He did not call for Fenwick or send for the physician from the other end of the corridor and stand back while the appropriate people handled it. He picked her up from the floor of his study with his arms under her back and her knees, and he walked, fast and direct, through the corridor toward her rooms. And the 2 servants who saw him in the hallway at 2 in the morning pressed themselves against the wall and stared with the wide-eyed attention of people watching something they understood was not normal. He was not thinking clearly. He recognized this the way you recognize a storm from inside it, not as analysis, but as the specific sensation of a system that had been running controlled and organized for 31 years, suddenly running on something rawer and faster and much less manageable. She was conscious. Her eyes were open and her face was the tight white of someone managing serious pain with everything available, and she had one hand gripping his arm with a force that told him the management was costing her considerably. I'm all right, she said, through her teeth. You're not. I'm telling you I'm all right, so you don't... I heard you. He pushed open the door to her rooms with his shoulder. Stop talking. He got her onto the bed and she released his arm and he straightened, and the handprint she'd left on his sleeve was white-knuckled deep, and he looked at it for a half-second and then turned and went to the door and said, into the corridor at a volume that was not quite a shout, but carried the specific force of a command that expected immediate compliance. Get the physician, now, and send for Marta. The physician arrived in 6 minutes. His name was Callum. He had served Raverin for 12 years, and he had the unflappable steadiness of a man who had seen most of the things a human body could produce in a crisis and had developed a working relationship with all of them. He examined Eveline with quiet efficiency while Lucien stood in the corner of the room and did the thing he did least well in his entire life, which was nothing. He was not a man who stood in corners. He was a man who moved through rooms and situations with the organizational force of someone who had never once encountered a problem that didn't yield to sufficient pressure or sufficient intelligence. And he stood in this corner and watched Callum work and felt the walls of that identity press against something that would not yield to either, and the feeling was unlike anything he had experienced in 21 years of running an empire. It was not fear exactly. Fear was a tactical input. It sharpened attention. It focused resource. What he was feeling was something below fear, something older and less organized, the specific formlessness of a man who has discovered that the thing most essential to him is at risk, and that there is nothing in his considerable arsenal that addresses the situation. Marta arrived and positioned herself at the head of the bed with the solid practicality of a woman who had delivered 3 of her own children and attended 6 others, and the 2 women communicated in the efficient shorthand of people managing the same crisis from different angles while Callum continued his assessment. Finally, Callum straightened and looked at Lucien. "The child is not in immediate danger," he said, "but the Duchess needs to be completely still for the next 24 hours. No movement, no stress, complete rest. The pain is a warning, not yet a crisis. If we address it immediately and she rests, the outcome should be good." Lucien said, "Should be. Medicine doesn't trade in certainties, my lord. Should be is the best I can give you at 2 in the morning with the information I have." A pause. "What do you need?" "The herbs Marta is already preparing. Someone sitting with her through the night. And you," Callum said, with the straightforward calm of a man who had been watching dukes in distress for 12 years and had long since stopped being intimidated by the title, "out of this room so she can rest without spending her energy managing your reaction." Eveline made a sound from the bed that in a less exhausted woman would have been a laugh. Lucien looked at her. She was propped against the pillows with Marta arranging the covers around her, and her face was still tight and pale, but her eyes were clear, and they held his gaze with the same directness they had always held it, not asking for anything, not performing anything, simply present and clear, and entirely herself even at 2 in the morning with her body staging a crisis. Something in his chest did something he didn't have language for. "I'll be in the corridor," he said. "My lord," Callum said. He went to the door. Then he stopped and turned back and looked at her, and the look was not the assessment look, or the controlled look, or any of the looks she had catalogued in her systematic way over the past 12 weeks. It was something he had not shown anyone in a very long time, possibly since he was 20 years old and his father's body was being carried off a battlefield, and the Empire was deciding whether to fall. "Don't," he said. One word, the full weight of everything he was not saying sitting behind it. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not planning to," she said. He stood in the corridor for 4 hours. He stood there in the cold stone dark of Ravarin at 3 in the morning and 4 in the morning, and he thought about the fact that he had spent 12 years building something. The Empire, the Order, the system of control and loyalty and calculated efficiency that ran through every choice he made and every person he trusted. And he had built it on the premise that the thing you protected most was the thing you could least afford to lose. He had spent 12 years deciding that what he could least afford to lose was the stability of Ravarin, the political position, the Empire's integrity. He had made those things the center and organized everything else in relation to them, and the system had worked, and people had called him ruthless or brilliant, or both depending on their position, and he had not particularly cared either way because both assessments were accurate and neither was the point. He stood in the corridor and listened to the silence from behind the closed door, and he understood, with the cold, comprehensive clarity of a man who had just had the entire premise of his organization revised in the space of 4 hours, that he had been protecting the wrong thing. Not wrong as in mistaken, wrong as in incomplete. The kind of wrong that you can only identify from the outside, after something has gotten in past the perimeter and shown you what the perimeter was actually for. Aldrich had been inside the perimeter for 30 years. She had been inside it for 12 weeks. And when he thought about losing either of them, when he held those two losses next to each other in the clear inventory-taking part of his mind, there was no comparison at all. At 6 in the morning, Marta opened the door and told him the Duchess was sleeping comfortably, and the physician was satisfied. He stood in the corridor for another minute after she closed the door, alone in the dark with the specific silence of a man who has arrived somewhere he has no map for and has decided with the same absolute decisiveness he brought to military strategy and political maneuvering and every other consequential choice of his adult life that he is going anyway. Then he went to his study to begin dismantling the man who had made the night necessary. So, Aldrich arrived at the study at 8 o'clock as instructed, with the composure of a man who had served this function for 30 years, and saw no reason to anticipate that this particular morning would be different from any other. He understood within the first 30 seconds that it was different. The records were on the desk. All of them. Assembled and ordered with the systematic clarity of someone who had spent the previous evening building a case rather than finding one, and Aldrich stood in front of them and went very still in the way of a man whose internal system has just registered that every exit has been identified and closed. Lucien sat behind the desk and watched him process it, and said nothing, because the silence was more useful than words at this stage, and because he was not yet certain he could say what needed to be said at the volume that a functioning conversation required. Aldrich looked up from the records. "How long?" he said. "How long have I known, or how long have you been doing it?" A pause. "Both. She found it yesterday. The routing numbers and the fourth quarter transfers." Lucien kept his voice flat and operational, which cost him more than Aldrich would ever know. "How long have you been running money to Morcant?" The silence lasted 8 seconds. He counted. 22 months, Aldrich said. "And the strategic information?" Another pause, shorter. 14 months, since the Morcant proposal. The fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room. Lucien looked at the man who had been a fixed point in the architecture of his life since before he could form clear memories, and he felt something that was not rage. Rage would have been simpler, but the specific grief of a structural failure, the feeling of weight-bearing stone giving way. "Why?" he said. Aldrich looked at him with an expression that was, of all the things it could have been, tired. "Because Morcant offered me a guarantee." Of what? Of Rivaren's survival under a new alignment. He said it with the flat conviction of a man who had been carrying this for 22 months and had built a sufficient internal justification to live with it. "You are building enemies faster than allies, Lucien. The Eastern Coalition is moving against you. The Morcant network controls coastal access, and if you lose that access, the Northern Empire starves inside 2 winters. I have been watching this empire for 30 years, and I made a calculation." "You made a calculation," Lucien said, flat, "that selling strategic information about my negotiating positions to the man who wants to dismember my empire was a calculation made for Rivaren's benefit. I made a calculation that Rivaren could not survive your pride intact." The room was very quiet. "Get out of my house," Lucien said. "Lucien, I want the full accounting of every transfer and every piece of information passed to Morcant on my desk by tonight. You will provide this because if you don't, I will pursue this through the imperial courts, and I will pursue it completely, which means everything, including Morcant's exposure, which will damage more people than just you." He looked at Aldrich with the gray regard that had no weather in it, nothing but the absolute settled clarity of a man who had arrived at a decision in a cold corridor at 3 a.m. and was not going to be moved from it. "You have until tonight." Aldrich stood for a moment, and in his face was something that might have been regret or might have been the last iteration of a justification that no longer quite held its shape. Then he nodded once and left. The full accounting arrived at 6 p.m. Lucien read it in the study where Eveline had collapsed 12 hours before, and the scope of it was worse than he had quantified the previous night, and better than his darkest estimate. Aldrich had been thorough, and had been systematic, and had been, this was the part that lived with him, genuinely convinced he was doing the right thing, which was its own lesson, delivered at considerable expense. He sent 3 letters before dinner, one to each of the lords whose recalibration Eveline's court intelligence had identified. The letters were direct and specific and offered something concrete rather than implication. He signed them himself, which was a departure from standard practice and one those lords would understand as deliberate. He also sent a message to Morcant, not through Aldrich, through a military courier with the D'Artois seal in black wax, and the message was 4 sentences long and contained no courtesy and no ambiguity. It named what Lucien knew. It named what Lucien would do with what he knew if the Morcant operation against Rivaren's grain network did not cease immediately. And it closed with a single line that was not a threat in the technical sense but was understood to be one in every sense that mattered. He did not know if it would hold. Morcant was not a man who accepted a closed door without looking for a window, and the information Aldrich had passed over 14 months gave him tools that could still be used in the spring assembly regardless of this message. The next 4 weeks would determine whether the 3 letters to wavering lords had moved fast enough to build a wall before Morcant could find the angle. He was working through the timeline implications of this when Marta appeared at his study door. "The Duchess is asking for you," she said. He was in the corridor before Marta finished the sentence. Eveline was propped against the pillows with the color back in her face, which was the first thing he registered, And the second thing was that she was holding one of the documents from the secure case he had been working from, which she had apparently asked someone to bring her. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I slept for 9 hours. Callum says I'm stable." She looked at him over the document. "You sent the Morcant message. Fenwick told you." Fenwick didn't have to. The military courier seal on the dispatch record was visible from the bed. She set the document down. Was it the right timing? He sat in the chair beside the bed, which was not where he would normally position himself, but felt correct in a way he didn't interrogate. "I don't know yet. It will depend on whether the assembly letters move fast enough." "They will." She said it with the same flat confidence she used for the estate accounts, the same certainty she brought to things she had thought through completely. "Lord Cawen was waiting for a direct approach from you personally. He'll commit within 48 hours of receiving it. Once Cawen commits, Aldenmore and Vethrin follow. They've been watching his position all season." He looked at her. "You knew this before last night," he said. "I knew it before the ball. I've been waiting for the moment to tell you." She held his gaze. "I was working up to recommending you write those letters yourself. Aldrich would have drafted them. I'm glad he didn't." The fire made its sound. Outside, Reverin's winter pressed against the windows with the patient permanence of something that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after. "How are you?" he said. Not the operational question. The other one. She looked at him for a moment. "Frightened," she said. And he understood it cost her to say it, understood that the woman who had stood in his study 4 months ago and looked at a cruel assessment without flinching was spending something real to offer him this. Not about the outcome. "Callum is confident. I'm frightened because I was not prepared for how much I wanted the outcome to be good." He held her gaze. "The child," she said quietly, and she stopped. The word she didn't finish sat between them with the same quality as the unfinished word in the ballroom, both of them in the same room as it, neither of them yet at the place where it could be said directly. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the coverlet. Not a gesture he had a history of making, not something that came from his managed system of controlled, purposeful action. It came from the place that the corridor had opened at 3 a.m, the place that had no operational vocabulary and needed none. She looked down at his hand, then back up at him. "Lucien," she said. "I know," he said. And for the first time in this specific and consequential 12 weeks, that was enough. 3 hours later, the rider arrived. Lucien heard the horse in the outer courtyard from the corridor, the specific urgent rhythm of a dispatch horse ridden hard, not the regular gate-change pace of scheduled correspondence. And he was at the window when the rider came through the gate with the Morcant crest on his dispatch satchel, which was wrong, deeply wrong, because Morcant should not have had time to respond yet, which meant this message had been sent before Lucien's message arrived, which meant Morcant had been moving before the confrontation with Aldrich, which meant the timeline Lucien had calculated was not the timeline Morcant was operating on. He was at the study door before Fenwick reached the corridor. "Bring it to me," he said. "Now." The message was 2 pages. He read it standing, and the specific quality of stillness that came over him as he read was the same quality that came over a military commander reading an engagement map and realizing that the enemy has been positioned for an hour while you were still planning the approach. Morcant had not been operating on the grain network as his primary instrument. The grain network had been the distraction, the thing that kept D'Artois' attention on the financial exposure while the actual play developed underneath it. The actual play was the spring assembly itself, and it had been in motion for 6 months, and Aldrich had not known the full scope of it, which was why his accounting, however complete, had not shown Lucien the real shape of what he was facing. Morcant had spent 6 months building a formal petition to the Imperial House, a petition that named Lucien D'Artois by name, that cited specific military decisions from the Northern campaigns 12 years ago, decisions that were, in the historical record, defensible but not unambiguous, and framed them as evidence of governance by coercion rather than legitimate authority. If the petition was presented at the spring assembly with the signatures Morcant had been collecting, and if the wavering lords had not yet committed to D'Artois, and if the Imperial House received it with the weight of what appeared to be broad noble consensus behind it, it would not destroy Reverin. It would not end Lucien. but it would open a formal review process that would run through the summer, freeze the grain network revenue and legal dispute, destabilize every alliance Lucien had spent 12 years building, and leave Ravarin exposed during the period when it was most vulnerable. And the assembly was in 19 days. He set the message down. 19 days to build a response to something that had been 12 months in construction. 19 days to move enough of the assembly to make the petition dead on arrival rather than the opening move of a dismantling. 19 days without Aldrich, with Eveline confined to bed, with Morcant already in position. He stood in his study at 10 o'clock at night and looked at the ceiling and felt the full weight of it settle. Not panic, nothing as disorganized as that, but the specific heavy clarity of a man standing at the exact edge of what he had built and looking at everything arrayed against it. He had been here before. At 20, on a different battlefield, with less at stake and less to lose, and the specific advantage of a young man who does not fully understand the cost of failure. He understood it now. He picked up a pen. The first letter he wrote was to Lord Caewin. It was the most direct thing he had written in 12 years of careful political correspondence. No buffer, no diplomatic construction, no space for interpretation. It named the situation. It named what D'Artois was offering and what D'Artois needed in return. It was the kind of letter you wrote when you had run out of time for anything except the truth. He wrote 4 more like it before midnight. At midnight he stood, and his back ached from the desk, and his hand was cramped from the pen. And the fire had burned down to coals, and he looked at the stack of letters and thought about the woman 2 corridors away who had spent 12 weeks building something in Ravarin that he had not known was missing, and who had been afraid tonight in the specific way of someone who has decided that something matters, and who is going to wake up tomorrow morning and ask him what was happening, because she always asked and always deserved to know. He thought about what he was going to tell her. Then he thought about Morcant, 2 days' ride south, with his petition and his signatures and his 19 days of preparation, waiting for the assembly with the settled confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Lucien sealed the last letter. There were things a man discovered about himself in the specific gravity of genuine loss. Not theoretical loss, not the managed risk assessment of a strategist calculating acceptable damage, but the real thing. The kind that put its hand through the controlled system and grabbed something that turned out to be load-bearing. He had discovered it in a corridor at 3 in the morning. He had not expected to discover it there. He was not sorry he had. It changed the calculation. Not the strategy, not the specific tactical work of the next 19 days, which was going to be brutal and exhausting and would require every instrument he had, but the thing underneath the strategy, the reason the strategy mattered, the weight that made the work worth the cost, that had changed, and the change was permanent. And Morcant, who had been playing this game for 12 months against a man who was fighting for an empire, was now going to discover what it looked like to fight a man who was fighting for something he loved. He put on his coat. He picked up the letters. And Duke Lucien D'Artois walked out of his study into the cold corridor of Ravarin Castle and went to find his courier. And the look on his face was something the servants who saw him that night would describe later in the months and years after as the look of a man who had decided something that could not be undecided, and who had discovered at considerable cost that he was considerably more dangerous for it. The 19 days were the hardest work of his life, and he had lived a life that was not short on hard work. He slept 4 hours a night, sometimes 3. He wrote letters that he had never written before in the specific sense that they required him to be visible in ways he had spent 12 years learning to avoid. Direct about need, direct about what he was offering and what he was asking for in return, stripped of the diplomatic buffering that allowed powerful men to negotiate without appearing to need anything. He had always understood that appearing to need nothing was itself a form of power. He was discovering at considerable speed that there was a different form of power available to a man who had decided that the appearance was less important than the result. Lord Caewin committed on the 2nd day. Aldenmore on the 4th. Vethrin took until the 8th, which was later than Eveline had predicted and earlier than Lucien had feared, and when the letter arrived with Vethrin's seal, he sat with it for a long moment before he read it, in the specific way of a man who has been running on tension so long that the arrival of good news requires a moment of recalibration. He read it. Then he took it to Eveline's rooms, where she had been confined to bed for 8 days and was managing this confinement with the concentrated discipline of a woman applying her full systematic capability to the task of staying still, which meant she had reorganized the household correspondence workflow from her bed and was managing 3 active administrative projects through Oren and Marta and a young secretary named Petra, who had been promoted by necessity and was discovering, under Eveline's quiet supervision, that she was considerably more capable than anyone had previously thought to tell her. He set Vethren's letter on the bed beside her. She read it. She looked up at him. "That's enough," she said. "It's enough to make the petition contestable. It's not enough to make it dead." "It will be dead." She said it with the flat certainty she brought to all her assessments, and he had learned in 19 days what he had only partially understood in the 12 weeks before them, which was that her certainty was not confidence performing as certainty. It was the specific product of a mind that had done the calculation completely and was reporting the result. Morcant needs 7 more signatures to reach the threshold for a formal imperial review. He has 5. The 3 you've moved account for 4 of the 7 he would have had. He cannot reach the threshold now without lords who have already committed to you, and lords who have committed to you publicly will not reverse that commitment for Morcant without cause you haven't given them. Lucien looked at her. "You've been tracking his signature count from your bed." "I've been tracking it since the ball. I had a working estimate before you found out about Aldrich." She met his gaze. "I didn't tell you because I was waiting to see if my estimate was right before I offered it as certainty." He stood in her room with the winter light coming through the window behind him, and he thought about the specific texture of the last 19 days, the letters, the sleeplessness, the courier rides back and forth, the weight of managing an empire in crisis without the man who had managed it alongside him for 30 years. And he thought about the fact that she had been carrying this number in her head since the ball, quietly, the way she carried everything, without seeking credit for it or deploying it prematurely. "Was your estimate right?" he said. "Close enough." A pause. "I was off by 1 on Alden Moore's timing." He sat down in the chair beside her bed. Not the operational posture of a man conducting a briefing, just sitting in the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running on purpose and adrenaline for 19 days and had arrived at a room where neither was required. She watched him sit. "When did you last sleep?" she said. "I sleep." 4 hours is not sleep. It's a postponement. It's sufficient. Lucien. His name in her mouth, still with that quality it had taken on since the night she had said it without armor, the quality that meant she was about to say something that cost her something to say. "The assembly is in 2 days. Morcant's petition will fail. The empire is not going to fall. You can sleep." He looked at her for a long moment. The winter light was doing the thing it sometimes did in this room, catching the specific angle of her face, the planes of it behind the glasses she wore because she needed them to see. And he thought about the library months ago, and the ballroom, and the carriage, and the corridor at 3 in the morning, and the 19 days. And he thought about all the things he had built in his life, and the specific and complete failure of any of them to prepare him for this particular room with this particular person in it. "After the assembly," he said. She held his gaze. Then she nodded, because she also knew when to push and when to let a thing be, which was one of the many things about her that he had no adequate accounting for. The spring assembly convened on a gray morning that smelled like the last edge of winter finally considering its departure. Ian arrived in the assembly hall with the 3 committed lords, Kaiowin, Alden Moore, Vethren, and 7 others whose positions had been shored up in the previous 19 days, and the specific geometry of the room shifted when he walked in. The way it always shifted, but differently now, with a weight behind it that was different from the weight of a man who ruled by fear. Fear produced a particular kind of room geometry, careful, watchful, arranged around the avoidance of a center. What he saw now was something else, something that looked, he thought with the detached part of his mind, that never stopped observing, like men who had been directly approached and directly offered something real and had decided that was worth standing beside. Morcant was already there. He stood with his delegation on the far side of the hall, and when Lucien entered, he looked across the space at him with the assessment of a man running a rapid recalculation. Lucien could see him counting the lords at Lucien's back, counting the signatures he had lost, arriving at the number that Eveline had arrived at from her bed 2 days ago, the number that made the petition unviable. Morcant's face showed nothing, which was the professional courtesy of a man who understood that showing what he was feeling in this room would cost him more than swallowing it. But in his eyes, in the specific quality of his stillness, Lucien read the recognition. The play had failed. The assembly proceeded through its formal business with the organized efficiency of an institution that had been managing the competing interests of powerful men for generations, and had developed sufficient procedural armor to do so without catastrophe. Lucien spoke twice, both times with the directness he had been practicing in letters for 19 days, and the room responded with the specific attention of people who had been shown a new variable and were updating their understanding of it. When the moment came for Morcant to present his petition, he did not. He rose, and the room held its breath, and he looked across the hall at Lucien with something that was not quite acknowledgement but occupied its territory. And he said that House Morcant was withdrawing its proposal in favor of pursuing the matter through bilateral negotiation with the relevant parties. The room exhaled. Not triumphantly. It was not that kind of room. But the specific collective relaxation of a space in which a crisis has been resolved without requiring the building to come down was palpable, and Lucien sat with it for a moment before he stood to speak. And what he said was not what he would have said 6 months ago, or even 19 days ago. It was direct, and it was specific, and it offered Morcant a working path forward that preserved enough of the coastal trade relationship to give the man a reason to take it, because the lesson Eveline had given him in the accounts room months ago, the one about closing doors versus leaving exits, had worked its way into his operating system at a level below conscious strategy. You do not need to destroy what you can afford to redirect. He had not learned that from 12 years of running an empire. He had learned it from a woman who ran a household. He was back at Ravarin by nightfall. He went first to Eveline's rooms and found her sitting up in bed with Callum in the chair beside her, and an expression on her face that told him the visit had gone well before Callum said a word. "She can resume normal movement tomorrow," Callum said, with the satisfied tone of a man whose forecast had proved accurate. "Light activity for 2 weeks, then full resumption of her usual schedule." He stood, gathered his bag. "The child is well. She is well. I expect a straightforward remainder of the pregnancy, barring further incidents of being awake at 2 a.m. reviewing estate accounts during a political crisis." Callum left with the specific diplomatic invisibility of a physician who had learned when a room needed to be empty. Lucien sat in the chair Callum had vacated. Eveline was watching him with the clear, settled look she had worn since the first day. The look that had no performance in it, that simply looked at whatever was in front of it and reported what it saw. "It's over," she said. Morcant withdrew. "I know, Fenwick told me." A pause. "How did it feel?" He considered this. He was not a man who was often asked how things felt, and he was not a man who had devoted significant resources to knowing, and the question from her had a quality that made him want to answer it accurately rather than adequately. "Smaller than I expected," he said finally. "The winning." She looked at him without surprise, which meant she had expected something like this answer, which meant she understood something about the texture of victory that he was only now arriving at himself. "Because you built the victory on different materials than you usually use," she said. "Yes. It doesn't feel like conquest when the thing that moved people was honesty rather than force." He held her gaze. "No. It feels like something that might actually hold." The room was quiet. Outside, Ravarin's winter was giving way at the edges, the specific quality of the light through the window carrying the first suggestion of something less implacable. "Aldrich," she said. He had known they would come to this. "He's gone. He left the day after the confrontation. I let him go without pursuing the imperial courts. The accounting he provided was complete, and it would have cost more to prosecute than to absorb the loss and move forward." He looked at his hands for a moment, the gesture he had borrowed from her without knowing he was borrowing it. He believed he was right. "I know. That's the part that doesn't resolve cleanly." He looked up at her. A man who betrays you for money is comprehensible. A man who betrays you because he decided he understood your situation better than you did, and that the betrayal was therefore a service. He stopped. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, she said quietly. You just have to know it happens, that the people closest to you are the ones with the most complete picture of your vulnerabilities and the most convincing reasons to themselves for how they choose to use that picture. She met his gaze. It doesn't mean you stop trusting people. It means you understand what trust actually costs and you extend it anyway, deliberately, with your eyes open. He looked at her for a long time. Is that what you did? He said. With me. The question landed in the room with the full weight of everything it contained. The first meeting, the cruel assessment, the months of systematic building in a castle that hadn't been built for her, the nights and the crisis and the 19 days. She held his gaze without flinching. Yes, she said. It's exactly what I did. He reached out and took her hand, the same gesture he had made the night before the assembly, the gesture that had no operational vocabulary and needed none, and he held it with the deliberate care of a man who understood now what he was holding and what it had cost to still be holding it. I was wrong about you, he said, from the first day. I want you to know that I know it. I know you know it. I need to say it plainly. She looked at him. Then say it plainly. He held her gaze and he said it. Not the version that managed the vulnerability, not the version that preserved the distance, but the plain version, the one that came from the place the corridor had opened at 3 a.m. and that had been making decisions for him ever since. He said it in the raw American cadence of a man who had finally run out of diplomatic construction, and it was not elegant, and it was not composed, and it was the truest thing he had said in 12 years. She listened to all of it. When he finished, the room was very still. Then she said, I know. I've known for a while. And the look on her face was the look of a woman who had spent 24 years learning to expect very little from the world, and had arrived, through the specific and unlikely route of a political arrangement and a bankrupt estate, and a man who had called her plain on the first day, at something she had not planned for and could not systematize, and had decided, with every clear-eyed instrument she possessed, to keep. Their son was born 6 weeks later, on a morning when the last snow of the season was melting off the castle walls, and the courtyard had the specific smell of stone releasing winter. The labor was long and hard, and Lucien sat outside the door for 11 hours, and the servants who passed through the corridor gave him a wide berth. Not because he was frightening. He was not frightening in the way he had once been frightening, but because there was something about him that required space, the specific gravity of a man for whom the hours were each their own weight, and who was carrying all of them simultaneously. He thought, in those 11 hours, about the things a man accumulates in the space between who he was and who he is, and whether the accumulation is worth the cost of what it takes to get there. He had spent 12 years deciding that the only ledger worth keeping was the one that measured power and stability and the integrity of what he had built. He had been wrong about this in the specific way that a man can be wrong about the premises of his entire adult life. Not completely, not in a way that erased the value of what he had built, but in a way that revealed it as insufficient. A foundation without a structure without anything worth sheltering inside it. The door opened at 11 hours and 14 minutes. Marta looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been in that room and knew what it had cost and was not going to pretend otherwise. She's asking for you, she said. He went in. Eveline was exhausted in a way that was visible in every line of her, the specific deep exhaustion of a body that has done something it was built for, but that takes everything available to do. Her hair was loose and her face was bare, and she was not wearing her glasses, and she was holding a child in the crook of her arm with the careful, deliberate tenderness of someone still learning the weight of a new thing. She looked up when he came in. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and new and was making the specific sounds of a creature that has just discovered the world is louder and colder than wherever it was before, and has not yet decided how it feels about this. He's healthy, Eveline said. Callum says he's perfectly healthy. Lucien looked at his son for a long time. Then he looked at Eveline. and the look was the one she had seen in the library and the ballroom and the corridor and all the accumulated places between those and here, except that it was not restrained now, not held back by the controlled system or the managed distance or the 31 years of architecture built specifically against being moved. He put his hand against the side of her face, carefully, the way you touch something you are aware of the value of. "You are not plain," he said. "You have never been plain. I want you to know that I know that too." She looked at him, and her eyes were very clear. "I know what I am," she said. "I've always known. I was waiting for you to." He stayed beside her until she slept, which was not long. The exhaustion was too complete for anything except surrender to it. And he sat in the chair with his son in his arms, and the fire burning low and Ravarin settling around them in the way that old stone settles, patient and permanent. And he held the child with the careful, deliberate attention of a man learning a new kind of weight and finding it, against every prior expectation, the weight he had been missing. The second Royal Winter Ball came 6 months later, at the end of a summer that had rebuilt what winter had damaged. The grain network ran cleanly under Eveline's administrative restructuring, the revenue transparent and accountable in a way it had not been for 2 years. The 3 committed lords had become 7, then 12, and the D'Artois position in the spring assembly had shifted from contested to foundational in the specific way that positions shift when they are built on something people have decided they can trust, rather than something they have decided they cannot afford to oppose. Morcant had taken the bilateral path. It was slow and occasionally contentious and was being managed by a new secretary named Petra, who had turned out to be exactly as capable as Eveline had suspected, and who negotiated with the quiet, precise confidence of a woman who had been taught by the best. They traveled to the capital in their own convoy, which was larger now, and when they arrived at the residence, Eveline organized the household with the same efficient attention she brought to everything, while Lucien handled the formal calls, and they crossed paths in the corridor on the evening before the ball, and he stopped and looked at her in the way he looked at her now, which had no distance in it. "Are you ready?" he said. "I've been ready since the last one," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. Ouch. She wore dark red this time, the color of something decided rather than something offered, and she wore her glasses because she needed them to see, and she entered the ballroom at Lucien's side with her back straight and her chin level and the specific quality of presence that had been there all along and had simply been waiting for a room that deserved to see it. The court saw her. The ripple moved through the room differently than it had at the winter ball. Not the uncertain recalibration of a room encountering an unknown variable, but the specific recognition of a room acknowledging something it had underestimated and was revising its understanding of. She saw the revision happening in real time, in the turning of heads and the shift of conversations, and the specific attention of men and women who understood power well enough to read its new configuration. Lucien felt it beside him. He had always known how to read a room. What he had not known, until a year ago, was how to be in one with someone whose presence changed what the room was measuring. They moved through the evening with the ease of people who had survived something together and had arrived on the other side of it with the specific confidence of survivors. Not triumphant, not performing, simply present in the way that people are present when they no longer need the room to tell them what they are. Cassian Morcant approached them at the second hour. He was alone, which was its own statement, and his face carried the expression of a man who had decided that this particular piece of business needed to be handled in the direct style rather than the oblique one. He looked at Eveline first. "My Lady D'Artois." The name this time was correct. "Duke Morcant," she said pleasantly. He held her gaze for a moment with something that was, she thought, as close to respect as his architecture allowed, and she received it the way she received everything, clearly, without inflation, for exactly what it was. He looked at Lucien. "The new terms Petra sent last week. Are you accepting them?" "I'm accepting 2 of the 3. The coastal access clause needs revision. Petra will be in contact." Morcant nodded once. He looked between them both with the expression of a man who had played a very long game and arrived at the board in a different position than he had planned for, and who was capable enough to recognize that the position, while not his preferred one, was workable. Then he inclined his head. To her, specifically, a degree more than courtesy required. and withdrew. Lucien looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Two of the three," she said. "We'll get the third. Petra will get the third. She's better at it than either of us." He made the sound that lived in the same neighborhood as a laugh, which she had been collecting instances of for months, because each one was specific and unrepeatable in hers. They stood together in the middle of the ballroom of the imperial capital, and the court moved around them in its complex geometry of ambition and alliance, and the chandeliers threw their light across 100 conversations. And she was wearing red in her glasses and the specific expression of a woman who had spent 24 years becoming exactly who she was and had arrived at a place where that was precisely enough. He leaned down slightly, close enough that only she could hear. "The plain woman he dismissed," he said quietly, "built everything worth having in my life." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the room. "No," she said, "she was never plain. You just weren't looking." He straightened. He took her hand in the middle of the ballroom in front of the assembled court of Valadorn with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of a man making a statement he has no intention of retracting. The Empire saw it, and the Duke of Reverin, who had once looked at his wife and found her insufficient, stood in the most important room in the kingdom and held her hand like it was the only thing in the room that mattered, because he had learned, through betrayal and crisis and 11 hours outside a door and 19 days of sleeping 4 hours a night, that the thing you dismiss without looking is sometimes the thing you cannot survive losing, and that the man who learns this is always changed by it, and that some changes, arriving late and at great cost, are worth every bit of what they took to get there. Revarin endured, not because of fear, not because of force, but because one quiet woman had arrived in a cold castle in winter and had refused, with every systematic and clear-eyed instrument she possessed, to be less than what she was, and because one hard man had finally, at considerable cost to his pride and his certainties and his 31 years of carefully maintained distance, had the sense to see her.